The potato salad was still sitting on the table when my mother said it, not even loudly. That was the thing about Patrice. She never needed volume. She picked up her fork, looked at me from across the folding table, and said with a particular smile she reserved for comments shaped like compliments, "It would be easier for everyone." 23 people at that table, 2 uncles, 3 aunts, cousins I hadn't seen since a wedding in 2019, and not one of them said a word. My dad Gil took a sip of his beer and studied the sky like he was counting clouds. My aunt looked down at her plate. My uncle Vernon found something fascinating about his corn, and my son Theo, 6 years old, 2 teeth missing, ketchup on his chin, legs swinging because the bench was too tall for him, looked up at me and whispered, "Mama, does Grandma not want me here?" Before I could open my mouth, my 13-year-old daughter Marlo set down her burger, wiped her hands slowly on her napkin, pushed her chair back from the table, stood up, looked directly at my mother, and said 2 words. Say that again. Not a scene, just those 4 syllables, steady as a locked door. "My name is Karen. I'm 30, for I live in Dayton with my 2 kids, Marlo, who is 13 going on 45, and Theo, who just turned 6 and believes deeply in the moral superiority of stegosauruses. I work 3 days a week as a dental hygienist and pick up admin shifts at a walk-in clinic on weekends. I'm not wealthy. I'm not desperate. I'm the kind of person who pays the electric bill on time, but still dreads a flat tire in February. You know exactly what I mean. Here's what you need to understand about my mother before any of this makes sense. Patrice is not a loud woman. She doesn't throw things or raise her voice. Her particular talent is precision. She'll compliment your haircut and add, "It's so brave to try something new at your age." She'll say she's proud of you and then spend the next 40 minutes explaining how well your cousin is doing. My dad learned decades ago that agreeing with Patrice costs less than disagreeing, and by now I think he's forgotten he was ever allowed to have his own opinions. I don't blame him. I understand it, but understanding a thing doesn't mean you have to live inside it forever, for years. And I mean years, not months. I was the one who held the financial seams of that family together when their furnace broke 2 winters ago. I sent $12 when my dad needed new tires, and they were behind on insurance. That was me too when my mother threw herself a birthday dinner at a steakhouse and conveniently forgot her wallet. I think you can guess how that ended. I never complained, not once, because that's what you do for family, isn't it? You tell yourself one day they'll be there when you need them. They weren't. The one time I asked my mother to watch Theo for a weekend, Theo, who goes to bed at 8:30 without a fight and will eat whatever you put in front of him. That same weekend I saw on Facebook that she'd hosted a card game for 6 friends and made 3 kinds of dip. I swallowed that. I always swallowed it. My cousin Diana, my mother's sister's daughter, 40 minutes away in Springfield, was the only person who ever looked me in the eye and said, "Karen, you don't have to keep doing this." She saw how my mother treated me. Every time I called her crying after some cutting remark, Diana would say, "Write it down. One day you'll need to remember why you stopped. I should have listened sooner." The picnic was a 4th of July cookout at Eastwood Metro Park, organized by my aunt Rella. The whole extended family was there. Someone brought a speaker playing old Motown. Thea spent the afternoon playing tag with Diana's boys, shared his juice box with a little girl he didn't know, and when he scraped his knee on the sidewalk, he walked over to me and said without crying, "Mama, I think I need a dinosaur band-aid." My mother had been watching him all afternoon with a look I recognized, like she'd bitten into something sour. Every time he ran past her chair, she sighed when he bumped the table, and a cup of lemonade tipped into the grass, onto the grass, not onto anyone, she said loud enough for half the table to hear. "This is exactly why I let it go. I cleaned up the lemonade. I told Theo to be careful." Then came dinner, then came the smile, then came what she said. I had already opened my mouth to say something careful and measured, the kind of sentence I'd been rehearsing my whole life, the one that keeps the peace at the price of yourself. When Marlo stood up, my mother did a little laugh. The dismissive one she keeps ready. "Marlo, sit down. This is an adult conversation," Marlo said, "then stop acting like a child." My Uncle Vernon actually choked, but Patrice doesn't lose arguments, especially not to a teenager. She looked at me, not at Marlo, at me, and said, "This is what happens when you don't teach your children respect." I felt the old familiar pull in my chest, the reflex to apologize, to grab Marlo's arm, to smooth everything down. I'd been doing it for 34 years, but something was different this time. Maybe it was watching Theo's face. Maybe it was hearing my own daughter do what I'd been too afraid to do for my entire adult life. I looked at my mother and said, "Patrice, Theo is your grandson. If you can't treat him like family, I don't see why I should keep treating you like mine." Then I packed up my kids, my potato salad, and whatever was left of my dignity, and I walked to the car. That was the beginning. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. Theo fell asleep in the back seat. Still holding his dinosaur toy, Marlo stared out the window the whole ride. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes after I parked engine off, listening to the crickets, asking myself how many times I'd driven home from a family event with that same knot in my stomach. The answer was every time, every single time. That night, I called Diana. She picked up on the first ring. When I finished telling her everything, she said, "Karen, you've been writing checks for people who wouldn't give you a glass of water if you were on fire. When are you going to stop?" I was still in my kitchen at 11 o'clock, smelling like sunscreen and charcoal. I said tonight. 9 days later, my mother called, not to apologize. That would require her to believe she'd done something wrong. She called to mention that their water heater was making a noise and my father was only working part-time and her knees had been so bad and she just didn't know what they were going to do. The long loaded silence that was supposed to make me reach for my wallet. I said, "That sounds really stressful. I hope you figured out." The pause on her end was so long I checked to see if the call had dropped. She tried again. 2 days later, same script, different bill. I gave her the same answer. "Diana texted me every morning, day 12 of choosing yourself, keep going." And I needed every one of those messages because stopping the money was harder than I expected. When you've been the family fixer long enough, it becomes your identity. You stop knowing who you are without it. Then the backlash started, not from my mother. Patrice doesn't fight her own battles when she can recruit an army. First, my Aunt Gail called to tell me I was being selfish and that family helps family. Gail, who had never babysat once, never come to a single school event, never sent my parents so much as a birthday card with a check inside. Then my mother's friend Barbara, a woman I'd spoken to maybe 6 times in my life, called to say she'd heard I was abandoning my struggling parents, and she hoped I'd think about what kind of example I was setting for my children. Barbara, who I once watched steal a centerpiece from a church potluck, I almost caved some days. I want to be honest about that. What kept me steady was Theo. About 3 weeks after the picnic, he sat down at the kitchen table while I was making dinner, opening and closing his mouth like he was working something up. Finally, he said, "Mama, am I bad?" I turned off the stove. I sat next to him. "Why would you ask?" "That because Grandma doesn't like me, so maybe I'm bad." This kid who says "excuse me" to mannequins at Target when he bumps into them. This kid who draws pictures of our family with everyone smiling. He was sitting there genuinely trying to figure out what he had done wrong. I held him and told him he was the best thing that had ever happened to me. He seemed okay. After that, he went back to his dinosaurs. I went to my bathroom, closed the door, and cried sitting on the floor. That's when I made the second decision. The first was cutting off the money. The second was bigger. I wasn't attending any more family events until my mother apologized, not to me, to Theo. She needed to look that boy in the eye. I called and told her exactly that. She said, "You're going to punish me over a joke. You've always been too sensitive." I said, "Then it should be easy to apologize for a joke." She hung up. What happened next, I didn't see coming. About 5 weeks after the picnic, Marlo came home acting strange, checking her phone and flipping it face down on the table. After Theo was in bed, she stood in my doorway with her arms crossed and said, "Mom, I need to show you something, and I need you not to freak out." My mother had gotten Marlo's number probably from Aunt Gail, who has the boundary awareness of a screen door in a hurricane, and had been texting my 13-year-old for 3 days. The messages started sweet, then shifted the way Patrice always operates. She told Marlo that I had always been emotional, that I overreacted even at her age, that maybe Marlo could talk to me on her behalf. She was using my daughter as an emissary, and she never once asked how Theo was. He didn't exist in those messages. What I didn't know yet was that Marlo had been writing back to the message about me being emotional. Marlo had written, "My mom's not emotional. She's just done pretending everything is fine when it isn't. There's a difference." And to the one asking Marlo to intervene, "I'm not gonna ask my mom to forgive someone who hasn't apologize. That wouldn't make sense, would it?" I stared at that phone for a long time. Then I looked at Marlo chewing her thumbnail, waiting to be grounded, and I said, "You are the most incredible human I have ever met." She said, "So I'm not in trouble, honey. The only person in trouble is your grandmother." I screenshotted every message and sent them, no commentary, just the images, to everyone who had called me selfish: Aunt Gail, Uncle Vernon, Barbara. One line, "This is what she's doing now." Gail called back and for the first time didn't lead with a defense of my mother. She said, "I didn't know she was doing that." I said, "There's a lot you don't know, Gail, because you only ever listen to one side." Diana called me, laughing so hard she could barely talk. Then she drove 40 minutes from Springfield with a large pepperoni pizza and a stuffed triceratops for Theo, because in her words, "This kid deserves a present for no reason. That's the kind of family I want around my children." 2 weeks of silence from my mother. After the screenshots, then one Saturday morning a knock at the door, my dad Gil on my porch in his old fishing hat holding a bakery bag. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He sat at my kitchen table and said, "I brought those cinnamon rolls you liked when you were little." Then this man, who I had never once seen cry in my entire life, put his face in his hands and sobbed. He said he'd been afraid of that woman for 37 years, that every time I sent money, he felt sick that he'd brought it up with her once years ago, and she hadn't spoken to him for 11 days, so he never mentioned it again. Then he said, "What if I stopped bending 2 days later?" He told her the picnic was wrong, the texts were wrong, the years of depending on me were wrong, and if she didn't fix it, she'd lose him as well. 9 weeks after the picnic, my phone rang. Long silence on her end. "Then I need to talk to Theo. I owe that boy an apology, and I owe you one too." I let the silence sit. Then I said, "I'll think about it." Diana said to let her come on my terms in my house. If she blew it, that was it. So I invited her for dinner the following Sunday, just for me, Marlo, and Theo, and told her to come with a real apology, or not come at all. She arrived in a dress she never would have worn to a casual dinner. She brought yellow tulips, my favorite. I hadn't known she remembered. Theo was on the couch watching cartoons. He looked up at her and didn't move, didn't run to her the way he used to, just watched. I saw it cross her face, what she had done. She walked over, knelt down, and said, "Theo, Grandma needs to tell you something. What I said at the picnic was wrong and mean, and you did nothing wrong. You are my grandson, and I love you, and I am so sorry." Theo looked at her for about 5 seconds, then he said, "It's okay, Grandma. Do you want to see my new dinosaur? 6 years old, no grudge, no conditions, just grace, the kind adults keep forgetting exists." She hugged him and cried, real tears, the kind where your shoulders shake and you can't form words. Over dinner, she apologized to me, said she knew she'd been unfair for years, said she was going to start seeing a therapist, which nearly knocked me off my chair because Patrice is always called therapy. Paying a stranger to hear you complain. She looked at Marlo and said, "I owe you an apology, too. I should never have sent those messages. You were right to stand up for your brother." Marlo said, "Thank you, Grandma, but just
so you know, I'll do it again if I
have to." My mother actually laughed, a real one. "I believe you." She said, "I'm not going to tell you everything is fixed. Trust doesn't rebuild on a single dinner. I don't send money anymore, and that isn't changing." My dad took a full-time job at a hardware store and talks about lumber grades with more enthusiasm than I've heard from him in years. Aunt Gail dropped off a casserole and said, without quite making eye contact, "I shouldn't have gotten involved the way I did." Uncle Vernon still hasn't said a word to me directly, but at Thanksgiving he sat next to Theo and asked him the name of every dinosaur in his collection one by one. For Vernon, that's practically a love letter. Diana still comes over every other weekend with pizza and her boys. Last week, she texted me day 147 of choosing yourself. "Look how far you came." I cried reading that, good tears. I think what surprised me most wasn't the confrontation or the fallout or even my mother's apology. It was realizing that I had been so busy protecting the peace that I'd forgotten it was never actually peaceful, not for me and not for my kids. Some things look like stability from the outside and feel like slow erosion from the inside. Knowing the difference is harder than it sounds. So let me ask you something. If you have been the person in your family who keeps everything running, who swallows the comments and sends the checks and smooths everything over, have you ever stopped to ask yourself what you're actually protecting and whether it's protecting you back?